The wind over Silver Creek does not whisper. It scrapes across the land like a warning. Into that wind walks Clara Miller, a widow with no home, no money, and a truth buried somewhere in the Colorado dust. At Whispering Pines Ranch, she finds work, shelter, and a silent cowboy with storm-gray eyes. But the West has a cruel way of bringing the dead back to speak, and before long, Clara must decide whether the man beside her is her protector or the reason her world fell apart. If this story stayed with you, please give it a like, share it with someone who loves Western tales, and subscribe for more powerful stories from the heart of the frontier.
The wind in Silver Creek didn't blow. It scraped. It carried coarse grit off the open plains and threw it against the wooden storefronts like a handful of cheap salt. It was a wind that dried your throat and stung your eyes. Clara Miller stood in the dead center of the street. She didn't flinch. She just held the leather handle of her battered trunk a little tighter. Her knuckles were white. Her shoes were coated in fine red dust. It was 1878, a hard year to be a woman alone in the Colorado Territory. An even harder year to be a widow with nothing but a worthless, crumpled promissory note in her pocket. The bank had just said no. The man behind the polished mahogany desk hadn't even looked at her properly. He had just adjusted his spectacles, shaken his head, mumbled something about a lack of tangible collateral, and called for the next customer. He dismissed her, like she was a speck of dirt on his ledger. So Clara stood in the dust. She looked up and down the street. The town was booming, but not for people like her. She looked at the Golden Spur Saloon. It was loud. It smelled like stale beer, unwashed bodies, and bad decisions. It wasn't a place for a former Boston schoolteacher. The piano music spilling out the swinging doors was erratic and jarring. But hunger had a funny way of changing a person's geography. Starvation didn't care about propriety. She smoothed the front of her dark woolen skirt. She checked the pins in her auburn hair. She took one long, deep breath, and she walked through the doors. The noise died down. Not completely, but enough to make the air feel thick. Eyes turned. Heavy, assessing eyes from miners, drifters, and cattlemen. She ignored them all. She kept her chin parallel to the floorboards and walked straight to the long, scarred bar. The saloon owner, a heavy-set man named Higgins with a sweat-stained collar, was wiping down the counter with a dirty rag. He looked up. He looked her up and down. It wasn't a respectful look. It was the look a butcher gives a cheap cut of meat. "We don't serve unescorted ladies, ma'am," he said. His voice was thick with cheap whiskey and natural condescension. "I'm not here for a drink," Clara said. Her voice was quiet. But it was perfectly pitched. It carried over the low hum of the room. "I'm here for work." Higgins stopped wiping. He stared at her for a second. Then he let out a loud bark of laughter. A few men at the nearby poker tables joined in. "Work?" Higgins leaned his thick elbows on the bar. "What kind of work? You looking to entertain the boys upstairs? Because you look a little stiff for that." In the back corner of the room, sitting entirely in the shadows, Elias Thorne went perfectly still. Elias was a man who owned the largest ranch in the valley, a sprawling spread called Whispering Pines. He had hands the size of dinner plates, permanently calloused from barbed wire, branding irons, and hard winters. He had a reputation for being hard, strictly fair, and exceedingly quiet. Very quiet. He was in town waiting on a shipment of grain. He had stepped into the saloon for a cup of black coffee while his wagon was being loaded. Now his coffee was getting cold. He watched the woman at the bar. She was slight, pale, dressed in mourning clothes that had clearly seen better days, but her spine was pure steel. She didn't shrink away from Higgins's laughter. "I'm looking to scrub your floors," Clara said, her voice cutting through the chuckles. "To wash your dishes. Honest labor, Mr. Higgins. For an honest wage." Higgins scoffed. He leaned closer to her, invading her space. "A lady like you? Scrubbing spittoons?" Higgins mocked, waving a hand at the filth on the floor. "I don't think so. You'd quit by noon and expect a full day's pay. Besides, I don't hire stray women off the street. It's bad for business. Makes the place look desperate. You want charity, go to the church. If you want money in this establishment, you know exactly how women earn it here." Elias felt a familiar cold anger flare deep in his chest. It tasted like ash. He pushed his chair back. The heavy wood scraped loud against the floorboards. He was going to throw Higgins through his own front window. But before Elias could take a single step forward, Clara spoke. She didn't raise her voice to a shout. She didn't tremble. She didn't cry. She spoke with the practiced, deliberate cadence of a teacher addressing a deeply ignorant, unruly child. "I may be poor, sir, but poverty does not strip me of my humanity." The words rang out, clear as a church bell. Every man in the room stopped shuffling their cards. Clara held Higgins's gaze, refusing to be made small. "Respect is not something you dispense only to those with coin in their pockets. It is a basic human right. A right that every living soul deserves regardless of their gender or their bank account. I offered you my honest labor. You offered me an insult. Keep your floors dirty, Mr. Higgins. They match your character perfectly." She turned on her heel. Elias stopped breathing for a second. He had seen brave men charge into gunfire. He had seen desperate men fight over scraps. But he had rarely seen someone stand with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their back and demand that the world treat them like a human being. It hit him right in the chest, right where the guilt lived. 4 years. For 4 long, agonizing years, Elias had carried a ghost. A man he had shot by mistake in the dark during a rustler raid. A man who died because Elias pulled the trigger, and then lacked the courage to tell the law the whole truth. He had hidden behind a lie of a stray bullet. He had spent every single day since trying to balance an impossible moral scale, punishing himself with endless labor. He watched Clara walk proudly toward the swinging doors. The men in the saloon were too stunned by her dignity to utter a single catcall. Elias didn't think. He simply moved. He caught up to her just as she stepped back out onto the wooden boardwalk. The sun was dipping low, casting long, bruised purple shadows across the dirt road. The air was turning bitter cold. "Ma'am," his voice was deep, a low rumble of thunder from a distant storm. Clara stopped. She didn't turn around immediately. She braced herself. When she finally turned, her guard was visibly up. She looked at him, a tall, imposing man, broad-shouldered, wearing a weathered Stetson and a heavy, dust-coated canvas duster. His eyes were gray, like winter clouds holding snow. "If you followed me out here to repeat Mr. Higgins's vile suggestions, I assure you, my answer remains the exact same," Clara said. Elias took off his hat. He held it in his big hands. It was a gesture of respect, automatic and deeply ingrained. "I wouldn't insult you like that, ma'am," Elias said. "My name is Elias Thorne. I run a cattle outfit a few miles out of town. Whispering Pines." Clara studied him. Her brown eyes were sharp, searching for the trap. "And?" "And," Elias said, matching her steady, unhurried tone, "I heard what you said in there about labor, about respect. They were just words to men who refuse to understand them. I understand them." Elias looked down at his dusty boots, then back up to meet her eyes directly. "My books are a mess. I pay my hands fair, but the numbers don't line up the way they should. I need someone who knows how to run a ledger, someone who isn't afraid of hard work or hard truths." Clara tilted her head. The cold wind caught a stray strand of her auburn hair. "You need a bookkeeper?" "Yes, ma'am, and a teacher. I've got families working for me. 5 kids on the property who don't know an A from an anvil. They need schooling. The county refuses to send anyone out this far." Clara looked out at the dusty street. She looked back at her lonely, heavy trunk sitting in the dirt. Then she looked straight into Elias's gray eyes. "Mr. Thorne, I have no money. I have no horse. I have nowhere to sleep tonight. I am telling you this so you understand my position." Elias nodded slowly. He didn't pity her. "I have an old line cabin on the edge of the property. It's not much to look at. But the roof holds tight. There's a cast-iron stove. It's yours if you take the job." He wasn't smiling. He wasn't flirting. He was offering a lifeline wrapped cleanly in a business transaction. Clara measured him. She had spent the last agonizing months on the East Coast learning how to spot liars and cheats. She saw none of that in Elias Thorne. She saw a man who carried a heavy, invisible load, offering to let her carry a small piece of it for pay. "I will not take charity," Clara stated, her voice ironclad. "I ain't offering any," Elias replied smoothly. "I need the help. You need the wage. It's an exchange. I expect to be paid fairly for my time. You'll get the going rate for a ranch foreman, plus your provisions. No less." Clara's eyebrows rose slightly. That was generous, incredibly generous for a woman in 1878, but she didn't argue the point. "And one more thing, Mr. Thorne." Elias waited. The wind howled around them. "My name is Clara Miller." She squared her shoulders, looking up at him. "And I require to be treated as an equal on your ranch. Not as a delicate woman who needs sheltering. Not as a desperate stray you took pity on. But as a human being performing a vital task for your operation." Elias felt a sudden, violent tightening in his throat. Miller. The name echoed in his mind like a gunshot. It was a common enough name. It had to be a coincidence. He shoved the thought down into the dark box in his mind where he kept his nightmares. "Mrs. Miller," Elias said, his voice quiet but absolute. "Out here the land doesn't care if you're a man or a woman. The winter freezes us all the exact same way. You do the work, you earn the respect. That's a promise." Clara held his gaze for a long, silent moment. Then, slowly, she extended her right hand. She didn't wear gloves. Her skin was pale, but her grip was firm and steady. Elias took her hand in his massive, calloused one. He didn't squeeze too hard, just enough to seal the deal. "My wagon is over by the feed store," Elias said, putting his hat back on his head. "I'll fetch your trunk." "I can carry my own belongings, Mr. Thorne." "I know you can, Mrs. Miller," Elias said gently. "But you're on my payroll now. Let me do the heavy lifting today." Clara didn't fight him on it. She was exhausted, down to her very marrow. She watched this quiet, massive cowboy walk over, pick up her heavy leather trunk with one hand as if it weighed nothing at all, and carry it toward a sturdy buckboard wagon. She followed him. She didn't know it yet, but she was walking onto the very land that held the bloody answers she was so desperately seeking. And Elias didn't know it yet, but he had just invited his own violent reckoning under his roof. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, pulling a heavy blanket of twilight over Silver Creek. The bitter cold set in. But for the first time in months, Clara Miller had a job. She had a roof. And she was going to make absolutely sure this cowboy kept his word. The wagon ride out of Silver Creek was a quiet affair. Elias Thorne didn't talk much. Clara Miller didn't press him to. The heavy buckboard rattled over the rutted dirt road. The wooden wheels chewed through the frost. The cold out here was a physical thing. It had weight. It pressed against Clara's dark woolen coat and tried to find her bones. She pulled her collar up. She stared straight ahead. The landscape changed as they left the town behind. The flat, dusty plains gave way to rolling foothills. Pine trees began to appear, first in small, scattered clusters, then in thick, towering walls of dark green. The air smelled different here, cleaner, sharper. It smelled like crushed needles and old snow. "Almost there," Elias said. His voice startled her. He hadn't spoken for nearly an hour. He didn't turn his head when he spoke. He just kept his eyes on the road and the team of draft horses. Clara nodded, though he couldn't see it. 10 minutes later, they crested a ridge. The Whispering Pines Ranch stretched out below them. It was vast. A sprawling valley caught between two high, jagged ridges. There was a large main house built of heavy logs, a massive barn, a dozen outbuildings, corrals holding hundreds of head of cattle. The scale of it was staggering. Elias steered the wagon past the main compound. He drove a half-mile further down a narrow, winding track. He pulled the horses to a halt in front of a small structure. It was a line cabin. Rough-hewn logs, a pitched roof made of cedar shakes, a single window with glass that was thick and wavy, a small stone chimney sticking up from the back. It looked lonely, isolated against the backdrop of the massive, dark forest. Elias tied off the reins. He stepped down from the wagon. "It ain't the Palmer House Hotel," Elias said. He walked to the back of the wagon and effortlessly hoisted her heavy trunk onto his shoulder. "But the roof doesn't leak, the stove drafts well, and the door has a heavy iron latch." Clara climbed down. Her legs were stiff from the cold. She followed him up the 2 wooden steps and into the cabin. It was dark inside. It smelled like old ash and dry dust. But it was dry. That was something. There was a narrow bed frame with a rope mattress, a small wooden table, 1 sturdy chair, and a heavy cast-iron stove in the corner. Elias set her trunk down at the foot of the bed. It landed with a heavy thud. "I'll have one of the boys bring down a load of split oak," Elias said. He took off his hat and looked around the small space. "And some provisions, flour, coffee, salt pork. You can take your main meals up at the cookhouse with the crew if you like. Or cook for yourself here." "I prefer to cook for myself," Clara said. Elias nodded. He didn't ask why. He just accepted it. "Suit yourself. I'll have the foreman draw up a work contract tonight. You can come up to the main house tomorrow morning after breakfast. We'll sign the papers and get you started on the ledgers." "I appreciate that, Mr. Thorne." Elias put his hat back on. He lingered by the door for a fraction of a second. He looked at her standing in the middle of the empty, dusty room. She looked small, but she didn't look defeated. "Lock the latch tonight, Mrs. Miller," Elias said softly. "Not because of my men, but because the wolves get bold when the snow sets in." He closed the door behind him. Clara stood in the quiet cabin. She listened to the wagon rattle away. Then she walked to the door and dropped the heavy iron latch into place. It made a solid, comforting sound. The next morning, the sky was the color of bruised iron. Clara walked the half-mile up to the main house. She had scrubbed her face. She had brushed the dust from her skirt. She walked with purpose. The ranch was alive. Men were shouting. Horses were whinnying. The smell of wood smoke and roasting bacon hung thick in the cold air. She walked up the wide steps of the main house and knocked on the heavy oak door. A man opened it. He wasn't Elias. He was a tall, broad-shouldered African-American man. He had a face that looked like it had been carved out of dark walnut, deep lines around his eyes, silver in his hair. He wore a heavy canvas coat and held a clipboard. "You must be the new teacher," he said. His voice was deep and steady. "I'm Marcus, foreman of this outfit." "Clara Miller," she said. She extended her hand. Marcus looked at her hand for a second. Out here, a lot of folks wouldn't shake his hand. He met her eyes. He saw the genuine expectation there. He reached out and shook it firmly. "Mr. Thorne is waiting for you in his office," Marcus said. He stepped aside to let her in. "Down the hall, last door on the right." Clara walked down the wide hallway. The house was strictly functional. No rugs, no fancy paintings, just solid wood, clean floors, and the smell of coffee. She found the office. The door was open. Elias was sitting behind a massive oak desk. It was covered in stacks of paper, leather-bound ledgers, and loose receipts. He looked up when she knocked on the door frame. "Come in, Mrs. Miller, have a seat." Clara sat in the straight-backed wooden chair opposite him. Elias pushed a piece of paper across the desk. Next to it, he placed a pen and a small bottle of black ink. "That's the contract," Elias said. "It states your duties. Managing the accounts receivable, reconciling the supply ledgers, and teaching the children 3 afternoons a week. The pay is $40 a month, plus the cabin and your provisions." Clara didn't pick up the pen. She picked up the paper. She read every single line, slowly, deliberately. Elias watched her. He didn't rush her. Most people just signed. They were too desperate for the money to care about the fine print. But Clara wasn't most people. She finished reading. She placed the paper back on the desk. She looked at Elias. "The duties are acceptable," Clara said. Her voice was calm but firm. "The compensation is generous. However, I want to make something perfectly clear before I sign my name to your employ." Elias leaned back in his chair. The leather creaked. "Speak your mind." "I am taking this job and this roof through my own labor, Mr. Thorne," Clara said. She held his gaze. She didn't blink. "Not out of your charity. I know how the world views a widow with no means. They view her as a burden, a creature to be pitied or exploited. I will be neither." She paused. She made sure he was listening. He was. "I believe that in the workplace, men and women must be treated equally based on their competence," Clara stated clearly. The words hung in the quiet office. "I'm not asking for special treatment because I am a woman, but I am demanding that my work be valued exactly the same as a man's work. If my ledgers are clean, if the children learn to read, I expect the respect that comes with a job well done. No more, and certainly no less. I will not accept a wage that is secretly subsidized by your pity." Elias didn't look away. He didn't laugh. He didn't brush her off. He sat forward. He rested his heavy forearms on the desk. "I have never believed that gender dictates a person's worth, Mrs. Miller," Elias said. His voice was a low, steady rumble. Every word felt heavy, earned. "I don't care if you wear a skirt or trousers. I don't care where you came from. Out here, a person is measured by their character and their output." He tapped a thick finger against the contract. "You do the work, you earn the wage," Elias continued. "You balance my books, you get my respect. That is simply justice. I don't give charity. I make investments. And right now, I'm investing in your brain. Do we understand each other?" Clara looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the absolute sincerity in his gray eyes. "We do," Clara said. She picked up the pen. She dipped it in the ink. She signed her name with a steady hand. Outside the office, in the hallway, Marcus stood holding his clipboard. He had heard the entire exchange. When Elias walked out of the office a few minutes later, heading for the stables, Marcus fell in step beside him. "She's a tough one," Marcus noted quietly. "She has to be," Elias replied. Marcus looked sideways at his boss. "She carries it heavy, Elias. You can see it in her eyes. It's a deep grief. It looks exactly like yours." Elias stopped walking. He looked at his foreman. Marcus was the only man alive who knew the whole truth about the night in the canyon. The only man who knew Elias's secret. "Just make sure she gets whatever she needs for the cabin, Marcus," Elias said. He didn't address the comment. He couldn't. Elias walked away toward the barn. The cold wind bit at his face, but it was nothing compared to the cold knot sitting in his stomach. Down in the cabin, Clara was finally alone. She had a job. She had a contract. She was safe. For now. She walked over to her trunk. She knelt on the rough wooden floor and unbuckled the heavy leather straps. She threw open the lid. Inside were her meager possessions. A few dresses, a heavy shawl, some books. She reached beneath her folded clothes. Her fingers found a small hidden compartment at the bottom of the trunk. She pulled out a small, flat wooden box. She sat on the edge of the rope bed. She opened the box. Inside was a single piece of paper. It was folded neatly. The edges were worn from how many times she had opened it, read it, and folded it back up. She unfolded it now. It was a promissory note, a debt of $1,000. It was signed at the bottom in bold, aggressive ink by a man named Silas Vance. And right above it, co-signing the debt, was the signature of her late husband, Thomas Miller. Clara stared at the name. Her thumb traced the letters. Thomas was a good man, a gentleman. He wasn't a gambler. He wasn't a fool. He had never been West in his life until he got a strange letter and told her he had to go fix a terrible mistake. 6 months later, a telegram arrived in Boston. Thomas Miller dead, caught in crossfire, county marshal. Clara closed her eyes. The pain was still sharp. It didn't dull. The bank took her house to pay off the East Coast debts Thomas had supposedly accrued. They left her with nothing, but they had missed this one piece of paper. The paper Thomas had mailed back to her just a week before he died. She opened her eyes. They were completely dry. She didn't have any tears left. She only had resolve. "I'll find him, Thomas," Clara whispered to the empty cabin. "I'll find this Silas Vance, and I will find out exactly why you had to die." She carefully folded the paper. She put it back in the box. She slid the box under the mattress. Then she stood up. She tied an apron over her dress. She had a job to do. She had ledgers to balance, and she had a truth to hunt down. 2 days later. The wind had finally died down, but the cold had settled into the earth like iron. Clara walked into the main office just after breakfast. Elias wasn't there. Marcus was sitting at the desk, sorting through a pile of supply invoices. "Morning, Mrs. Miller," Marcus said, looking up. "Stove keeping you warm down there?" "It draws perfectly, thank you, Mr. Hayes," Clara said. She walked to the desk and set a small brown paper envelope down on the blotter. "Mr. Thorne asked for my identification documents for the county employment registry." Marcus nodded. He knew the drill. Silas Vance owned half the debt collectors in the territory. If a person didn't have legal registered employment attached to a recognized ranch, Vance's men could drag them into a debtor's prison on fabricated charges. Registering Clara with the county made her Elias's legal responsibility. It cast a protective shadow over her. "I'll make sure the boss gets these," Marcus said. He picked up the envelope. It was surprisingly light. "It's just my birth record and my marriage certificate," Clara said softly. "It's all I have left." Marcus looked at her. He saw the tight line of her jaw. "It's enough, ma'am. We'll get it filed in town by the end of the week. You're safe here." Clara nodded once sharply. "Thank you. I'll be in the schoolhouse if you need me." She turned and left. Marcus set the envelope on the very center of Elias's desk, right where the boss couldn't miss it. It was past midnight. The ranch was dead quiet. The only sound was the crackle of the logs in the massive stone fireplace of the main house. Elias sat at his desk. He had a glass of amber whiskey in his hand. He rarely drank. Only on the nights when the ghost got too loud. Tonight, the ghost was shouting. He stared at the small brown envelope sitting in the middle of his desk. He took a slow sip of the whiskey. It burned going down. Good. He needed the burn. He set the glass down. He reached out and picked up the envelope. He opened the flap. He pulled out the 2 pieces of thick, stiff paper. The first was a birth record from Massachusetts. Clara Ann Davis. He set it aside. He picked up the second piece of paper. It was an official marriage certificate. It was embossed with a state seal. Elias held it up to the light of the oil lamp. He read the names. Clara Ann Davis, joined in holy matrimony to Thomas Miller. Elias stopped breathing. His heart didn't just skip a beat. It stopped entirely. The silence in the room suddenly became a physical pressure pressing against his eardrums. Thomas Miller. The name wasn't just a coincidence. The world was vast, but it wasn't that vast. Elias's hands began to shake. Not a little tremble. A violent, uncontrollable shaking. The heavy paper rattled in his grip. He dropped it onto the desk as if it had caught fire. He pushed his chair back. He stood up fast. The chair tipped over and crashed to the floor. He didn't care. He backed away from the desk. He backed away from the piece of paper like it was a coiled rattlesnake. He hit the stone wall of the fireplace. The rough rock scraped through his flannel shirt. He closed his eyes. Flash. The dark canyon. The pouring rain. The panicked shouting of rustlers. The shadow of a man running through the brush. The flash of lightning. A metallic glint. A gun? A knife? Elias raising his rifle. The deafening crack. The man falling. Elias walking up to the body. turning him over. Finding no weapon. Just a frightened, dying man with a hole in his chest. A stranger. A man who whispered something Elias couldn't hear over the thunder. Then nothing. The county marshal asking questions. Elias lying. It was a stray bullet. Total chaos in the dark. I didn't see who fired. The cowardice. The heavy, rotting cowardice. Elias opened his eyes. He looked at the desk. He had brought the widow of the man he killed under his own roof. He had offered her a job. He had looked her in the eye and talked about justice, about respect. He had played the righteous savior. A wave of nausea hit him so hard he had to grip the stone mantel to stay upright. His chest heaved. He felt like he was suffocating. The air in the room was gone. God Almighty, Elias whispered. His voice was broken, ragged. What have I done? He stared at the piece of paper. Thomas Miller. She was here, sleeping in a cabin 500 yards away. A woman stripped of her life, her home, and her future, stripped by the bullet he fired. He had to send her away tomorrow with a bag of gold, enough money to go back east, enough money to never want for anything again. He would pay off his conscience with coin. It was the only way. If she stayed, the guilt would eat him alive. If she looked at him every day with those sharp, trusting brown eyes, he would shatter. Yes, he would send her away. Elias picked up the fallen chair. He walked back to the desk. His hands were still shaking as he carefully slid the marriage certificate back into the brown envelope. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in the dark, listening to the wind. The morning sun was brutally bright. It glared off the fresh frost on the windows. Elias stood behind his desk. He hadn't changed clothes. He had washed his face in freezing water, but it didn't hide the dark, hollow circles under his eyes. He looked like a man walking to the gallows. A knock on the door. "Come in," Elias said. His voice was hoarse. Clara walked in. She carried a stack of bound ledgers. She looked professional, composed. She set the ledgers on the edge of the desk. "Good morning, Mr. Thorne. I've reconciled the feed accounts for the last quarter." She paused. She looked at his face. Her brow furrowed slightly. "Are you unwell?" Elias looked at her. He looked at her pale skin, her auburn hair, the quiet, fierce dignity in her posture. "Send her away," the voice in his head screamed. "Give her the money and tell her to go." He opened his mouth. The words were right there on his tongue. "Mrs. Miller, I've made a mistake. I don't need a bookkeeper after all." "I'm fine," Elias said instead. The words tasted like ash. "You don't look fine," Clara noted. "I didn't sleep." Elias gripped the edge of the desk. His knuckles turned white. "Mrs. Miller, about your employment here." Clara stood a little straighter. Her guard went up instantly. "Is there a problem with my work?" "No, the work is fine." Elias swallowed hard. "It's just, this is a hard place. It's isolated. It's dangerous. A woman in your position, you have your whole life ahead of you. Maybe staying out here in Silver Creek isn't the best course. If it's a matter of funds, I can advance you enough wages to buy a train ticket back east, help you set up a proper life." Clara's eyes narrowed. The warmth she had brought into the room vanished. "A proper life?" Clara asked. Her voice dropped 10 degrees. "A safer life," Elias corrected quickly, hating himself. "You don't belong out here, Clara, Mrs. Miller." Clara didn't move. She just stared at him. The silence stretched between them, taut as a wire. Then she spoke. "Mr. Thorne, I appreciate your sudden concern for my safety," Clara said. Her tone was sharp, clinical. "But I made my beliefs clear yesterday. I am capable of making my own choices, and my choice is to stay in Silver Creek." "Why?" The word tore out of Elias before he could stop it. "Why stay in this godforsaken dust bowl?" Clara took a step closer to the desk. She looked him dead in the eye. Because my husband was killed in this godforsaken dust bowl, Clara said. The words hit Elias like a physical blow. He didn't flinch, but everything inside him seized up. Clara kept going, her voice vibrating with suppressed emotion. The county marshal sent a telegram saying he was caught in a crossfire. A stray bullet, an accident. Clara let out a short, bitter breath. I don't believe in accidents, Mr. Thorne. Thomas wasn't a reckless man. He didn't wander into gunfights. Someone is responsible. Someone pulled that trigger. And someone out there knows exactly what happened. Elias felt the blood drain entirely from his face. He prayed the room was dark enough to hide it. I am not going back east, Clara stated. Every word was an iron nail being driven into a coffin. I am going to use my wages from this ranch to hire investigators. I'm going to ask questions in town. I am going to turn over every rock in this valley until I find out the truth about how Thomas died. She paused. She looked at Elias, her eyes flashing with absolute resolve. The truth isn't a luxury, Clara said, stating her belief clearly, forcefully. It is a right. Every human being has the fundamental right to know how their loved one was taken from them. I will not let my husband be swept under the rug of frontier justice. I will find the truth. Or I will die trying. She stopped. She waited for his response. Elias stared at her. He saw the fire in her eyes. It was a beautiful, terrifying fire. If he sent her away now with money, she wouldn't go to Boston. She would go straight into town. She would start asking questions. She would walk right into the sights of Silas Vance or the marshal, or whoever else didn't want the past dug up. She was a school teacher with no gun and no protection. The frontier would eat her alive in a week. He couldn't send her away. If he fired her, she would die. And that would be a second murder on his soul. He had to keep her close. He had to keep her under his roof where his men and his guns could protect her. He had to endure the absolute torture of looking his victim's widow in the eye every single day, knowing he was the monster she was hunting. It was his penance, and he deserved every second of it. Elias slowly let go of the edge of the desk. He stood up straight. The cowardice was gone, replaced by a grim, crushing resolve. You're right, Mrs. Miller, Elias said softly. The rumble in his voice was back, steady, unbreakable. The truth is a right, and you have the right to seek it. Clara looked surprised. She had expected a fight. You're not going to try to send me away again? No. Elias shook his head slowly. You have a contract here. You do the work, you keep the cabin. As long as you want it. Thank you, Mr. Thorne. Don't thank me, Elias said. He looked down at the ledger she had brought. Just do the math. Clara nodded. She turned and walked out of the office, closing the heavy oak door behind her. Elias stood alone in the quiet room. He looked at the spot where she had just stood. He felt the weight of the lie settling over his shoulders. It was heavier than before. He walked over to the window and looked out at the frost-covered ranch. He had invited the ghost in. He had given it a job and a roof. Now he just had to survive it. The schoolhouse was nothing more than an old bunkhouse. It smelled like dry pine needles and chalk dust. Clara stood at the front of the room. 5 children sat on wooden benches. They ranged in age from 6 to 12. They were the children of the ranch hands. Their clothes were patched. Their boots were scuffed. But their eyes were bright. She tapped the chalkboard with a wooden pointer. Read the sentence, please, Sarah, Clara said. Sarah, a small girl with missing front teeth, stood up. She followed the pointer. The dog runs fast. Excellent, Clara said. She offered a warm, genuine smile. Sit down, Sarah. Teaching was a refuge. It was the only time Clara didn't feel the sharp edges of her grief. When she looked at the children, she didn't see the bank that took her home. She didn't see the cold telegram. She just saw minds waiting to be filled. But the afternoons were different. In the afternoons, she sat at the heavy oak desk in Elias's office. She opened the thick leather-bound ledgers. The ink was faded in places. The handwriting was a heavy masculine scrawl. Elias Thorne was a brilliant rancher, but he was a terrible accountant. Clara ran her finger down a column of numbers. The math didn't make sense. The profits from the spring cattle drive were massive, but the bank deposits were incredibly low. She spent 3 days cross-referencing receipts before she finally understood the discrepancy. Elias wasn't losing money. He was giving it away. He paid his men double the standard wage for the territory. He covered medical bills if a hand broke a leg. He paid pensions to the widows of men who had died working his land. He bought premium grain for the horses, even when times were lean. He prioritized human lives and animal welfare over his own profit margins. It was foolish. It was terrible business. And it was the most decent thing Clara had ever seen. She sat back in the wooden chair. The ranch was quiet outside. She looked at the door, expecting the massive cowboy to walk in at any moment. He didn't. She picked up her pen. She dipped it in the black ink. She began to organize the chaos. She didn't change his spending. She just tracked it correctly. She made the ledger reflect the truth of the man. A week later, the winter truly broke open. It didn't snow, it sleeted. Hard, freezing rain that came down in sheets. The wind howled down the valley and slammed against the wooden walls of Clara's line cabin. It was past 9 at night. Clara sat by the cast-iron stove. She had a thick wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She was reading a worn copy of Dickens by the light of a single oil lamp. Drip. She looked up. Drip, drip. Water was falling from the ceiling, a slow, steady rhythm. It was landing directly in the center of her rope mattress. Clara sighed. She stood up. She moved her bedding to the dry side of the small frame. She grabbed a tin bucket from beside the stove and placed it under the leak. The freezing water hit the tin with a loud, hollow ping. She sat back down. She tried to read, but the sound was maddening. 10 minutes later, a heavy knock hammered on her door. Clara jumped. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She looked at the heavy iron latch. It was secure. "Who is it?" she called out. Her voice was steady, even if her hands weren't. "It's Elias." Clara walked to the door and lifted the latch. She pulled it open. Elias stood on the small porch. He was soaked to the bone. His heavy canvas duster was completely dark with rain. Water dripped from the wide brim of his hat. He held a wooden toolbox in one hand and a lantern in the other. "I saw the roof from the ridge," Elias said. His voice was loud over the howling wind. "The wind peeled back a few of the cedar shakes. You've got a leak." "I have a bucket," Clara said. "A bucket won't keep you warm when the fire dies," Elias said. He didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped inside and pushed the door shut against the wind. He took off his hat. He shrugged out of the heavy soaking duster and hung it on a wooden peg by the door. Underneath, he wore a thick flannel shirt. It was damp, clinging to the broad lines of his shoulders. "I can patch it from the inside," Elias said. He looked at the bucket on the bed. "Temporarily, just until the sleet stops." "Thank you," Clara said. She stepped back, giving him room. Elias dragged the sturdy wooden chair over to the bed. He stepped up onto it. The chair groaned under his weight. He reached up to the ceiling. His hands were massive, but his movements were precise. He pulled a piece of thick, tar-soaked canvas from his toolbox. He began to tack it over the leaking gap in the roof boards. Clara watched him. He worked in silence. The only sounds were the hammer driving short nails, the crackle of the stove, and the raging storm outside. He was incredibly focused. He didn't complain about the late hour. He didn't complain about the cold. He just saw a problem, and he fixed it. "There," Elias said. He drove the last nail in. He stepped down from the chair. "That will hold until morning. I'll send Marcus down with new shingles when it clears." He wiped his hands on a rag from his box. He looked at Clara. She was shivering slightly. The cabin had grown cold while the door was open. "I have coffee," Clara offered. She pointed to the metal pot sitting on the flat top of the cast-iron stove. "It's bitter, but it's hot." Elias looked at the door. He should leave. He knew he should leave. Every second he spent in this room was dangerous. Every time he looked at her, he saw the ghost. But the wind howled outside, and the coffee smelled good, and he was so incredibly tired of being alone in the dark. "Half a cup," Elias said. Clara poured the dark liquid into 2 tin mugs. She handed him one. Their fingers brushed. His hands were freezing cold, rough as bark. Hers were warm. Elias took a sip. It was terrible coffee. It was exactly what he needed. He sat down on the edge of the wooden chair. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, wrapped in her blanket. The space between them was small. "The ledgers are balancing," Clara said softly. "You pay your men too much." Elias looked at his mug. "A man breaks his back on my land. He deserves enough coin to feed his children. That's not charity. That's the cost of doing business right." "It's rare," Clara corrected. Elias looked up at her. The lantern light flickered across her face. It cast long, soft shadows. She was beautiful. Not in a delicate, fragile way. In a grounded, enduring way. Like a deep-rooted tree weathering a storm. "Why are you so stubborn, Clara?" Elias asked. The question slipped out before he could catch it. He used her first name. It felt entirely too natural. Clara didn't bristle. She looked at the fire through the grate of the stove. "You mean about my husband?" "Yes." Elias leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. The guilt was a physical ache in his jaw. "You have a safe place here. You have a wage. You have children who need teaching. Why can't you let the past bury the past? Why dig up graves?" Clara turned her head. She looked at him. Her brown eyes were calm, unflinching. "Because a grave is only peaceful if the truth is buried with it," Clara said. She took a slow sip of her coffee. Then, she set the mug down on the floor. "I am not seeking revenge, Elias. I am seeking dignity." She spoke the words clearly, deliberately. "The truth isn't just a comfort for the living. It is the final right of the dead. A man, no matter how poor, no matter how insignificant the world tells him he is, deserves to be remembered for the life he actually lived. He deserves to have his story told accurately, not erased to cover someone else's mistake." Elias stopped breathing. Clara kept her eyes locked on his. She spoke from the deepest part of her soul. "My husband was not a footnote in a county marshal's report," Clara said. Her voice grew stronger, resolute. "His life had value. He had a name. He had a family. Taking a human life is a tragedy. But taking their truth afterward? That is a profound violation of human rights. It treats a person like a piece of broken property to be swept away. I will not allow him to be swept away." The words echoed in the small cabin. They hit Elias like a physical barrage. Every word was a hammer blow to his conscience. He had treated Thomas Miller like broken property. He had swept him away to save his own reputation. He had stolen the man's final right. Elias stared at the floor. The shame was a living, breathing thing inside him. It crawled up his throat. It choked him. He couldn't sit here. He couldn't drink her coffee. He couldn't pretend to be her savior when he was her executioner. Elias stood up abruptly. The chair scraped loudly against the floorboards. "I have to go," Elias said. His voice was rough, grating. He didn't look at her. He grabbed his wet duster from the peg. He shoved his arms into the cold, damp sleeves. He jammed his hat onto his head. "Elias?" Clara stood up, confused by his sudden violent departure. "Is everything all right?" "The roof will hold," Elias said, staring at the heavy wooden door. He lifted the latch. The wind ripped the door out of his hand, slamming it against the exterior wall. Freezing rain blew into the cabin. Elias walked out into the storm. He pulled the door shut behind him with a heavy thud. Clara stood alone in the quiet cabin. She listened to his heavy boots sloshing away in the mud. She didn't understand what had just happened, but she knew one thing for certain. Elias Thorne was a man carrying a secret that was slowly killing him. 2 days later, the mud had frozen solid. Clara sat in Elias's office. The house was empty. The men were out riding the fence lines. She opened the oldest ledger on the desk, the one from 4 years ago. Elias never asked her to look at it, but Clara was thorough. She wanted to understand the financial history of Whispering Pines. She flipped through the yellowed pages. She tracked the supply purchases. Feed, wire, lumber. Then she saw a name, Silas Vance. The ink was dark. The entry was from the spring of 1874. It wasn't a purchase. It was a recorded dispute. Elias had noted a massive loss of cattle. Over 200 head stolen in the dead of night over a period of 3 months. Below that, in Elias's heavy scrawl, Vance buying up small deeds. Starving out the valley, rustlers are getting bolder, driven by Vance's debt collection. Clara stopped. She reached into her pocket. She pulled out the folded promissory note, the one Thomas had signed, the one co-signed by Silas Vance. She looked at the date on her husband's note. Then she looked at the date of Elias's ledger entry. They were exactly 3 weeks apart. Her heart began to beat a rapid, heavy rhythm against her ribs. Thomas hadn't come west to gamble. He hadn't come to prospect for gold. He had come because Silas Vance held a fraudulent debt over his family's head. And Vance was in Silver Creek, right here, operating in the exact same valley where Thomas was killed. It wasn't a stray bullet. It wasn't random chance. Clara closed the ledger. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. She stood up. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't wait for an escort. She walked down to the stables, borrowed a gentle roan gelding that Marcus let her ride, and set out for town. Silver Creek was ugly in the daylight. The frost made everything look gray and brittle. Clara tied her horse to the hitching post outside the general store. She didn't go in. She walked down the boardwalk. She was looking for a specific type of man. She found him in the alley behind the Golden Spur Saloon. He was sitting on an overturned barrel. He held a bottle of cheap rye. His clothes were ragged. He had a vicious scar running down his left cheek. Clara recognized him. He was one of the men who had laughed at her the day she asked for a job. The bartender had called him Coggins. Clara walked into the alley. The smell of rotting garbage and stale urine was thick. Coggins looked up. He squinted at her. "Well, well," Coggins slurred. "The high and mighty schoolmarm. Ain't you supposed to be safe up at Thorne's fortress?" "I need information, Mr. Coggins," Clara said. Her voice was ice. Coggins laughed. It dissolved into a wet, rattling cough. "I don't know nothing about books, lady. I don't want to know about books. I want to know about Silas Vance." The name hit Coggins like a slap. He stopped laughing. His eyes darted toward the street, suddenly paranoid. He lowered his bottle. "Nobody talks about Vance out loud, lady. You got a death wish?" "I have $2, Clara said. She opened her small coin purse. She pulled out 2 silver dollars. It was a week's wages, a fortune to a drunk. She held them up so the dull light caught the silver. Coggins stared at the coins. He licked his chapped lips. "What do you want to know?" he whispered. Clara stepped closer. She didn't show an ounce of fear. 4 years ago, Silas Vance was buying up debts. He was forcing men to do his dirty work, to rustle cattle from Whispering Pines. Clara kept her eyes locked on his. "Tell me about a man named Thomas Miller. He owed Vance money. He was here." Coggins flinched. He actually physically recoiled. "Miller," Coggins muttered. He looked at the bottle in his hand, then back at the silver. "I remember Miller. An Easterner, soft hands, wore spectacles." "Yes," Clara said. Her voice broke slightly. She forced it back to steel. "Tell me what happened." "Vance owned his paper," Coggins said, his voice dropping to a rapid, nervous whisper. "Forged half the debt, but the law didn't care. Vance told Miller to ride with us. We were supposed to hit Thorne's South Canyon, cut the wire, drive out 50 head. My husband was a thief? Clara asked. The pain in her chest was blinding. No, Coggins said quickly. He shook his head. No, he wasn't. That's the thing. The man was a fool. Too honest to live out here. Clara went perfectly still. Explain. We rode out to the canyon, Coggins said, staring at the dirt. Midnight, pitch black, raining like the devil. We got to the fence line. Miller pulled his horse up. He refused. He said he wouldn't steal another man's livelihood to pay a corrupt debt. He told Vance's foreman he was going to ride to the main house and warn Elias Thorne. Clara closed her eyes. Oh, Thomas. He turned his horse around, Coggins continued. His voice was shaking now. But our boys weren't going to let him ruin the job. They pulled their guns, started firing in the dark to spook his horse, drop him in the mud. Then, all hell broke loose. Thorne's men were already waiting in the canyon. It was a trap, bullets coming from everywhere. I ran. Everyone ran. When the shooting stopped, Miller was dead in the brush. Coggins looked up at Clara. He didn't steal a damn thing, lady. He died trying to do the right thing. Clara dropped the 2 silver coins into the mud at Coggins's feet. She turned around. She walked out of the alley. She didn't look back. She walked to her horse. She untied the reins. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold the leather. Her husband wasn't a criminal. He wasn't collateral damage in a random shootout. He was murdered by Silas Vance's greed. He was forced into a war he didn't want, and he died trying to save the very man she was working for right now. She swung up into the saddle. She kicked the horse into a hard gallop. Clara burst through the heavy oak doors of the main house at Whispering Pines. Elias was standing in the hallway talking to Marcus. He stopped mid-sentence when he saw her. Her hair was windblown. Her face was flushed with the cold. Her eyes were burning with a fire he had never seen before. Clara? Elias stepped forward. What's wrong? What happened? My husband wasn't a rustler, Clara said. Her voice was loud. It echoed off the wooden walls. Elias froze entirely. The air vanished from the hallway. Marcus slowly took a step back, his face unreadable. What? Elias managed to choke out. I went to town, Clara said. She walked straight up to Elias. She didn't care how big he was. She didn't care about propriety. I found one of Silas Vance's old enforcers. I asked him about Thomas. Elias felt the floor open up beneath him. He was falling. Clara pulled the promissory note from her pocket and shoved it against Elias's chest. He caught it instinctively. Silas Vance owned a fabricated debt on my husband. He forced him into that canyon 4 years ago to steal your cattle, Clara said, the words pouring out in a torrent of grief and rage. But Thomas refused. He refused to steal from you, Elias. He turned his horse around. He was trying to ride here. He was trying to warn you about the raid when the shooting started. He was caught in the crossfire. Elias stared at her. His gray eyes were wide, shocked. He died trying to save your ranch, Clara said. A single tear broke loose and tracked through the dust on her cheek. Elias looked down at the piece of paper in his hand. Silas Vance. The world tilted on its axis. For 4 years, Elias had believed he shot a desperate thief. It was a terrible guilt, but it was a guilt born of a chaotic defense of his property. But this? He had shot a man who was riding to save him. He had gunned down a hero in the dark. The guilt didn't lessen. It mutated. It became something sharper, something violent. The crushing weight on his chest suddenly ignited into a roaring, blinding inferno of absolute rage, not at Thomas, not at Clara, at himself, and at Silas Vance. Elias slowly crushed the paper in his massive fist. He looked at Clara. He saw her pain. He saw her unyielding demand for justice. Vance treats human beings like livestock, Elias said. His voice wasn't loud. It was a terrifying, lethal whisper. He spoke the words not as a rancher, but as a man viewing absolute evil. "This is exactly what unchecked power does, Clara," Elias said, his eyes burning with conviction. "When a man with money believes he is above the law, he stops seeing people as citizens with rights. He sees them as tools, expendable assets. Vance didn't just cause your husband's death. He orchestrated a system of economic slavery. It is an absolute violation of human dignity, and it ends now." Clara looked at him. She saw the rage. She saw the absolute alignment of their moral compasses. "What do we do?" Clara asked. She didn't ask if he would help. She knew he would. Elias turned to Marcus. "Lock the gates," Elias ordered. "Arm the men. Double the watch." He turned back to Clara. The distance between them was gone. The boss and the employee were dead. They were just two people standing in the wreckage of a corrupt world, holding the truth. "We are going to find the proof," Elias said, his jaw locked in iron. "And then I am going to tear Silas Vance's empire down to the bare dirt." Winter did not arrive in Silver Creek. It attacked. It came down from the jagged peaks in the dead of night. It buried the valley in 3 feet of powder. Then the temperature plummeted. The snow turned to ice. The world became a frozen, blinding expanse of white and gray. Clara Miller did not stop. She had a name now. Silas Vance. She had a cause. She rode the roan gelding out to the scattered homesteads. She wrapped herself in 3 layers of wool, but it wasn't enough. The cold found her bones. She asked questions. She knocked on doors. She looked for anyone else who held a forged note from Vance, anyone who remembered the night her husband died. People were scared. They closed their doors. They looked away. On the 4th day, the storm caught her. She was 2 miles from the ranch. The wind shifted. The sky turned a bruised, ugly purple. The snow came down completely horizontal. It was a whiteout. She couldn't see the horse's ears. She couldn't see her own hands. She let the horse lead. Animals knew the way home. She just held on. Her hands went numb, then her feet, then the shivering stopped. That was the dangerous part, the silence inside the cold. When the horse finally bumped against the wooden gate of the main corral, Clara couldn't move. She couldn't dismount. Marcus found her. He shouted for help. Elias came running from the barn. He didn't wear a coat. He didn't care. He waded through the waist-deep drifts, grabbed the reins, and pulled her down from the saddle. She fell against him. She was as cold as a stone. He carried her. He didn't take her to the line cabin. It was too far. The stove was too small. He carried her straight up the steps of the main house and kicked the front door open. "Get blankets," Elias barked at Marcus. "Heat the stones by the fire. Bring hot water." He carried her into the spare bedroom on the ground floor. He laid her on the heavy quilt. Her lips were blue. Her auburn hair was frozen to her cheeks. He didn't call for the ranch cook. He didn't call for a maid. He did it himself. He pulled off her frozen leather boots. He rubbed her icy feet with his massive calloused hands. The friction generated heat. He worked relentlessly. His jaw was set in a tight, grim line. Marcus brought the heated river stones wrapped in flannel. Elias packed them around her. He piled 3 heavy wool blankets on top of her. Then he sat in the wooden chair beside the bed, and he waited. The fever hit her at midnight. Her body realized it was surviving, and it fought back violently. She thrashed under the blankets. She muttered deliriously. She called out a name. "Thomas." Elias flinched. The name was a knife in the dark. He reached out. He took a cool, damp cloth from a basin of water on the nightstand. He gently placed it on her burning forehead. He smoothed her hair back. His touch was incredibly light. A startling contrast for a man who broke wild horses for a living. "I'm here," Elias whispered in the dark. It was a lie. He wasn't Thomas. But the sound of his low, steady voice seemed to calm her. He didn't sleep. For 3 days and 3 nights, Clara fought a brutal lung fever. And for 3 days and 3 nights, Elias Thorne did not leave the room. He fed the fire. He boiled chicken broth. He lifted her head and coaxed the warm liquid down her throat, 1 spoonful at a time. He wiped the sweat from her brow. He listened to her ragged breathing. He watched her. He saw the fierce set of her jaw, even in her sleep. He saw the way she refused to quit. He felt something shifting inside his chest, something heavy, something terrifying. It wasn't just guilt anymore. The guilt was still there, vast and deep. But something else was growing right beside it. A desperate, absolute need to see her open her eyes. On the morning of the fourth day, the fever broke. The sunlight reflected off the snow outside and filled the room with a brilliant, blinding light. Clara opened her eyes. Her throat was dry. Her body ached like she had been beaten with a wooden board. She blinked against the light. She realized she wasn't in the cabin. She was in a large bed. The sheets smelled like clean cotton and wood smoke. She turned her head. Elias was asleep in the wooden chair beside the bed. He looked terrible. His face was covered in 4 days of dark stubble. His clothes were rumpled. His massive shoulders were slumped forward. He looked utterly exhausted. Clara tried to sit up. She let out a small, ragged cough. Elias woke instantly. He didn't groggily come to. He was suddenly fully alert. He sat up straight. His gray eyes locked onto hers. "You're awake," Elias said. His voice was thick with sleep and relief. "Water," Clara croaked. Elias poured a glass from the pitcher on the nightstand. He slid his large arm behind her shoulders. He lifted her gently. He held the glass to her lips. She drank greedily. He lowered her back down to the pillows. "You've been out for 3 days," Elias said. He leaned back in the chair. He scrubbed a hand over his tired face. "You nearly froze to death out there, Clara." "I found 3 more families," Clara whispered. Her voice was weak, but the fire was still there. 3 more forged notes. Silas Vance. Elias let out a heavy sigh. He rested his forearms on his knees. "You can't fight a war if you're dead," Elias said softly. "You have to rest." Clara looked at him. She saw the dark circles under his eyes. She saw the empty bowls of broth on the side table. She saw the basin of water. "You stayed," Clara said. It was a statement, not a question. "I stayed," Elias confirmed. "Why?" Clara asked. "You have a ranch to run. You have men to do this. You are the boss." Elias looked down at his rough hands. He turned them over. He traced the deep scars on his palms with his thumb. The room was incredibly quiet. The silence felt intimate, heavy. "My father was a hard man," Elias started. His voice was a low, steady rumble in the quiet room. "He built this ranch with his bare hands. He used to say this world was built on iron and blood. He believed the only way to survive was to be harder than the land, harder than the men around you. You never show weakness. You never bend. You only break the things in your way." He looked up. He met Clara's eyes. "I believed him for a long time," Elias continued. "I acted like him. I thought that was what made a man strong: dominance, control, fear." Clara listened. She didn't interrupt. She saw the raw honesty in his face. "But I was wrong," Elias said. He spoke the words with absolute conviction. He needed her to hear this. He needed the world to hear this. "I learned it the hard way. The iron and blood worldview only creates more graves. It only creates men like Silas Vance, who view human lives as cheap currency." He leaned slightly closer. "I realized something," Elias said softly. "True strength isn't measured by the cattle you own. It isn't measured by the men you break or the fights you win. It is measured by your willingness to lift up those who have stumbled. It is measured by your capacity to offer grace when the world has only taught you cruelty. A society that abandons its weak is not a society at all. It's just a slaughterhouse." Clara felt a profound ache in her chest. It wasn't from the fever. It was from him. She looked at this massive, rugged cowboy, a man who looked like he had been carved out of the Rocky Mountains outside. Yet he carried a soul so deeply empathetic, it was staggering. "You believe that," Clara said. It wasn't a question. "I do," Elias said. "I try to live it, even when I fail." He reached out. He didn't think about it. It was a purely instinctual movement. He laid his large, rough hand over her pale, fragile one resting on the quilt. The touch sent a sudden electric shock through the room. It wasn't a caregiver's touch anymore. It was the touch of a man reaching for a woman. It was heavy. It was warm. It was incredibly grounding. Clara didn't pull away. She looked down at their joined hands. Then she looked up at his eyes. The space between them vanished. The air grew thick. She saw the sudden, stark vulnerability in his gray eyes. She saw the affection. She realized, with a sudden intake of breath, that she felt it too. She had spent months feeling nothing but cold grief and hot rage. But here in this room, under his quiet gaze, she felt warm. She felt incredibly safe. Elias stared at her. He felt the soft, steady pulse of her wrist beneath his thumb. He was falling. He was falling completely and hopelessly in love with her. And in that exact same second, the ghost walked into the room. "Thomas!" Elias felt the blood drain from his face. The warmth of the moment vanished, replaced by a freezing, suffocating wave of guilt. He was touching the hand of the widow he had created. He was speaking of grace while hiding a murder. He was a hypocrite of the worst order. Elias snatched his hand back. He stood up so fast, the wooden chair nearly tipped backward. Clara blinked, startled by the sudden violence of his movement. The loss of his warmth was jarring. "I'll have the cook send up some solid food," Elias said. His voice was suddenly gruff, distant. He wouldn't look at her. "You need to rebuild your strength." He turned his back on her. He walked quickly to the door. "Elias?" Clara called out, confused. He didn't stop. He walked out into the hallway and closed the door behind him. Clara lay in the quiet room. The fever was gone, but a new kind of ache settled in her chest. A deep, confusing ache. She touched her own hand where his fingers had rested. It still felt warm. She didn't understand the sudden terror she had seen in his eyes, but she was going to find out. 3 days later, Clara was back on her feet. She was still pale, and she tired easily, but the iron resolve had returned. She refused to stay in bed. There was work to do. Elias was gone. He had ridden out with Marcus and 5 hands to the northern ridge to inspect the fences. He had been avoiding her since the morning her fever broke. He spoke to her only about business. Short, clipped sentences. He wouldn't meet her eyes. Clara sat in his empty office. The fire was roaring in the stone hearth. She had finished updating the current ledgers. The numbers were clean. Now she decided to organize the room. It was a disaster. Elias kept receipts stuffed in random drawers. He stacked old maps on top of vital legal deeds. She started with the large oak bookshelf behind his desk. She pulled down dusty volumes on veterinary medicine. She stacked them neatly. She wiped down the wooden shelves. She reached for the top shelf. It was high near the ceiling. She had to stand on her toes. Her fingers brushed against something wooden. Something pushed far back into the corner, out of sight. She gripped it and pulled it down. It was a heavy, ornately carved wooden cigar box. It was covered in a thick layer of dust. It clearly hadn't been touched in years. Clara brought it down to the desk. She wiped the dust off the lid with her apron. There was a small brass clasp. It wasn't locked. She shouldn't open it. It was clearly personal. But Elias was a man of secrets, and Clara was a woman hunting the truth. She told herself she was just looking for more financial records. She unhooked the clasp. She opened the lid. There were no cigars. Inside lay a single thick leather-bound book, a journal. The leather was worn soft from use, but the edges were pristine. Clara hesitated. She stared at the book. The silence in the office felt suddenly heavy, expectant. She reached into the box. She picked up the journal. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was Elias's heavy, distinct scrawl. She began to flip through the pages. Most entries were mundane. Notes on weather, notes on cattle breeds, frustrations with delayed trains. Then she noticed a gap, several blank pages, then a single entry. The date was written at the top, October 14th, 1874. Clara stopped breathing. It was the exact date on the county marshal's telegram. It was the night Thomas died. Her hands began to tremble. A cold dread, heavier than the winter storm, seeped into her bones. She didn't want to read it. Every instinct screamed at her to close the book, to put it back, to walk away and live in ignorance. But she couldn't. She forced her eyes to focus on the dark ink. She read the words Elias Thorne had written in the dead of night 4 years ago. I pulled the trigger. The 4 words hit her like physical bullets. She gasped, a sharp, painful intake of air. She gripped the edges of the desk to keep from falling. She forced herself to read the rest. It was pitch black. The rain was blinding. The rustlers were running. I saw a shadow break from the tree line. I thought he had a weapon. I brought the rifle up. I pulled the trigger. Darkness, a flash, and a man named Thomas Miller fell. I turned him over in the mud. He had no gun. He was just trying to get away. He was trying to say something, but the blood stopped him. He died looking at me. The marshal asked who fired the shot. I lied. I said it was a chaotic crossfire. I said it was a stray bullet. I was a coward. I am a coward. The blood of an innocent man is on my hands. I can never wash it off. The journal slipped from Clara's fingers. It hit the desk with a dull thud. Everything shattered. The room spun. The fire in the hearth seemed to roar with a deafening noise. Clara backed away from the desk. She backed away as if the book itself were a venomous snake. Elias. The man who had offered her a job. The man who had given her a roof. The man who had spoken so beautifully about grace and human dignity. The man who had sat by her bed and held her hand. He was the monster. He was the man who murdered her husband. The betrayal was absolute. It wasn't just a lie of omission. It was a systemic, calculated manipulation of her entire reality. Every kind word, every generous wage, every warm look, it was all poison. It was blood money. He hadn't given her a job out of respect. He had given her a job to buy off his own suffocating guilt. He had turned her grief into his personal charity project. Clara didn't cry. The pain was too deep for tears. It bypassed sorrow and went straight to a cold, calcified fury. She stood in the center of the office. She waited. She didn't have to wait long. An hour later, the heavy front door opened. Heavy boots stepped into the hallway. The jingle of spurs, the deep voice of Elias talking to Marcus. The office door swung open. Elias walked in. He was dusting snow off his hat. He looked up, a greeting on his lips. The greeting died instantly. Clara was standing perfectly still behind the desk. Her face was a mask of carved ice. Her eyes were dark, fathomless pits of absolute rage. Elias stopped dead in his tracks. He felt the air leave the room. He looked down at the desk. He saw the open cigar box. He saw the leather journal lying open to the unmistakable page. The executioner had finally arrived. Elias didn't speak. He didn't rush forward to explain. He didn't offer excuses. He just stood there, his massive shoulders slowly dropping, accepting the blow he had known was coming for 4 years. "Did you really think?" Clara said. Her voice was not a shout. It was a deadly, quiet hiss. "Did you really think you could buy my conscience's silence with a paycheck and a leaky roof?" Elias swallowed hard. "Clara, please." "Do not use my name," Clara commanded. The authority in her voice was absolute. It whipped across the room like a lash. "You do not have the right to speak to me as an equal. You lost that right the moment you pulled the trigger and buried the truth in the mud." Elias took his hat off. He crushed the brim in his hands. "I was a coward," Elias said. His voice was broken, defeated. "I panicked. I made a terrible mistake in the dark, and I made an unforgivable choice in the light. I am so deeply sorry." "Sorry?" Clara let out a sharp, bitter laugh that held zero humor. You think an apology balances the ledger? You sat in that chair and lectured me about human dignity. You spoke about treating people with respect. She walked out from behind the desk. She closed the distance between them. She wasn't intimidated by his size. She was fueled by righteous, devastating fury. You want an education on human dignity, Mr. Thorne? Clara said, staring directly up into his gray eyes. True dignity requires autonomy. It requires the truth. You cannot rob a woman of her husband, steal the truth of his death, and then try to buy back her humanity with your guilt-ridden charity. That is not grace. That is profound arrogance. You used my poverty to soothe your conscience. Elias flinched, as if she had struck him across the face. He closed his eyes. Every word was true. Every word was a knife he deserved. I wanted to protect you, Elias whispered. You wanted to protect yourself, Clara fired back. Her voice finally cracked, the raw agony breaking through the ice. You wanted to look at me every day and pretend you were a savior instead of a killer. You made me dependent on the man who destroyed my life. She turned away from him. She couldn't look at his face anymore. It made her physically sick. She walked to the door. Clara, Elias pleaded, turning toward her. Where are you going? The snow is too deep. You can't leave the valley. Clara stopped at the threshold. She didn't look back. I am going to my cabin, Clara said, her voice dropping back to that terrifying, flat calm. I'm going to pack my trunk. I don't care if I have to walk through the snow to town. I will not spend another night eating food bought with my husband's blood. She walked out into the hallway. And Elias? Clara paused. Do not follow me. If you step foot near that cabin, I will take the shotgun from the wall and I will use it, and unlike you, I won't hide the body. She walked out the front door. It slammed shut with a finality that shook the windows. Elias Thorne was left standing alone in his office. He looked at the open journal. He looked at the empty doorway. He fell to his knees on the hard wooden floor. The ghost had finally won. The wind screamed down the valley. It carried knives of ice. Elias Thorne stood on the small wooden porch of the line cabin. He didn't wear his heavy canvas duster. He wore only a thin flannel shirt. The cold was a physical assault. It bit into his skin. It numbed his fingers. He didn't care. He deserved the cold. He deserved much worse. He raised his heavy fist. He knocked on the thick oak door. 3 slow, deliberate strikes. Inside, the cabin was dead silent. He knew Clara was there. He could see the faint orange glow of the cast-iron stove flickering through the wavy glass of the single window. He could feel her presence. It felt like a loaded gun pointed directly at his chest. He waited. He didn't knock again. A full minute passed. The wind howled. Then the heavy iron latch clacked loudly. The doors swung inward. Clara stood in the doorway. She was fully dressed. She hadn't packed her trunk yet. She held Elias's Winchester rifle in her hands. The barrel was pointed at the floor, but her finger rested dangerously close to the trigger guard. Her face was pale. Her eyes were red, but she wasn't crying anymore. The tears had frozen into absolute resolve. I told you not to come here, Clara said. Her voice was flat, empty. I know, Elias said. His teeth were beginning to chatter, but he locked his jaw. I'm not coming inside. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I'm here to give you the truth, all of it, without hiding behind a piece of paper. Clara stared at him. She looked at his freezing, shaking frame. She didn't feel an ounce of pity. You gave me the truth in your journal, she said. I gave you the facts in my journal, Elias corrected. His voice was a low, desperate rumble over the wind. I want to give you the man who did it. I want you to look me in the eye while I say it. You deserve that much. Clara didn't lower the rifle, but she stepped back half a pace. Speak then. Elias took a slow breath. The freezing air burned his lungs. 4 years ago, Elias started. He didn't look away from her. Silas Vance had been starving this valley. He was squeezing the small ranches dry. Rustlers were hitting my herds every week. My men were getting hurt. I was angry. I was tired. And I was arrogant. He swallowed hard. The memory tasted like copper. We got word they were hitting the South Canyon. I rode out with Marcus and the boys. We set a trap. It was pouring rain. Pitch black. When the shooting started, it was total chaos. Horses screaming, men shouting. I got separated from the group. Clara's grip on the rifle tightened. Her knuckles turned white. I saw a shadow moving in the brush, Elias continued. His voice cracked, but he forced it steady. I shouted for him to stop. He didn't. He turned toward me. In the flash of lightning, I saw something metallic in his hand. I thought it was a pistol. I didn't wait. I didn't think. I just raised my rifle and I fired. Elias closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. The ghost was right there, standing between them. He fell, Elias said. I ran up to him. I kicked what I thought was a gun out of his hand. But it wasn't a gun, Clara. It was a silver pocket watch. He was trying to check the time. He was trying to figure out how long he had to run. Clara let out a sharp, ragged breath. It sounded like a sob, but it was purely grief. I turned him over, Elias said, opening his eyes. Tears mixed with the freezing sleet on his face. He looked at me. He was terrified. He tried to speak. He tried to say a name. I think he was trying to say your name. And then he died. The silence between them stretched out. It was heavier than the storm. The marshal came the next day, Elias said. The shame in his voice was absolute. He asked who fired the fatal shot. And Clara, I was terrified. I had built this whole life on being the righteous man of Silver Creek, the man who protected people. I looked at the marshal, and I lied. I said it was a stray bullet. I hid my sin to save my own pride. Clara stared at him. The sheer, brutal honesty of his confession was staggering. He wasn't making excuses. He wasn't blaming the dark or the rain or Silas Vance. He was claiming the murder. You lied, Clara said softly. You built a wall of lies, and you dragged me inside it. I did, Elias said. He took a step closer to the doorframe. The wind whipped his hair. I brought you here because my guilt was eating me alive. I thought if I gave you a wage, if I gave you a roof, I could balance the scales. But I was wrong. I was profoundly wrong. He looked directly into her eyes. The cowboy was gone. The boss was gone. He was just a broken man standing in the cold. Listen to me, Clara, Elias said. He spoke the words with every ounce of conviction he possessed. True equality begins when we have the courage to look at each other as flawed human beings. I never stood above you to grant you this roof. I have been standing in the mud of my own sins. True respect doesn't mean giving someone a paycheck. It means giving them the truth, even when it destroys you. Clara lowered the rifle. Just an inch, but it was enough. I robbed you of your husband, Elias said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I robbed Thomas of his dignity. I cannot fix that, but I can stop running. He stepped back from the door. He stood in the snow. Tomorrow morning at first light, Elias said. I am riding into Silver Creek. I am going to the county marshal. I'm going to sign a full confession. I will tell them exactly what I did. I will hang for it, Clara, or I will rot in a cell, whatever the law decides. Clara froze. She hadn't expected this. She expected him to beg. She expected him to try to buy her silence. You're going to confess? Clara asked. Yes, Elias said simply. It's the only way to return Thomas's truth to him. It's the only way to treat you with actual respect. You can stay in this cabin. The ranch will be placed in a trust. Marcus will ensure you are paid for the rest of your life. He turned around. He began to walk back out into the freezing storm. Wait. The word was sharp. It cut through the howling wind. Elias stopped. He turned back. Clara stepped out onto the porch. The wind tore at her dress, but she didn't seem to notice the cold. She looked at this massive man. He was willing to throw his life away to give her a shred of justice. It was a beautiful, tragic, idiotic thing to do. If you go to the marshal tomorrow, Clara said, her voice raising to carry over the wind, you will go to jail. And Silas Vance will go free. Elias frowned. Vance didn't pull the trigger, I did. Vance loaded the gun, Clara fired back. She walked down the 2 wooden steps. She stood in the snow, inches away from him. Vance forged the debt. Vance drove Thomas into that canyon. Vance is starving this valley right now. If you turn yourself in, the only man who can stand up to Silas Vance is removed from the board. Vance wins. He takes this ranch. He takes my home. He erases Thomas completely. Elias stared at her. He was shivering violently now, but his mind was sharp. What are you saying? I am saying, Clara said, her eyes blazing with a fierce, terrifying light, that justice is not a simple transaction. You cannot just surrender to ease your own conscience while the true architect of this misery continues to destroy human lives. She reached out. She grabbed the front of his freezing flannel shirt. You owe me a debt, Elias Thorne, Clara stated. A massive debt. And you do not get to pay it by running to a jail cell. You're going to pay it by helping me tear Silas Vance's empire down to the dirt. You are going to help me find the proof that clears my husband's name of rustling. You are going to fight. Elias looked down at her. Her hands were small against his chest, but her grip was like iron. And after? Elias asked quietly. After Vance is done? After Silas Vance is in chains, Clara said, her voice unwavering. Then we will discuss your surrender. But until then, you work for me. Elias looked at her face. The raw courage there was blinding. He had never respected a human being more in his entire life. Understood, Elias said. Clara let go of his shirt. She looked at his shivering frame. Get inside, Clara ordered, before you freeze to death and ruin my plans. She turned and walked back into the cabin. Elias followed her. The heavy oak door shut behind them, locking out the storm. The thaw came fast. The ice melted into thick, sucking mud. But Silas Vance did not wait for the roads to dry. He knew Elias Thorne was digging. He knew Clara Miller was asking questions. Men like Vance didn't survive by waiting. They survived by striking first. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The sky was an empty, pale blue. Clara was in the line cabin. She was packing her ledgers into a canvas satchel. Elias had insisted she move up to the main house for safety. They had spent the last 2 weeks quietly gathering affidavits from ruined farmers. They were building a legal noose for Vance. They just needed the final piece, the physical proof of Vance's forged ledgers. Clara heard the horses first. It wasn't a wagon. It was a hard, fast gallop of multiple riders. It sounded like thunder rolling across the muddy ground. She walked to the window. 7 men were riding hard down the track toward her cabin. They wore long dusters. They carried repeating rifles. At the center of the pack rode Silas Vance. He was a wealthy man. He wore a fine wool suit and a bowler hat, looking entirely out of place in the mud. He looked like a banker. He acted like a butcher. Panic spiked in Clara's chest. She dropped the satchel. She ran to the heavy oak door and threw the iron latch down. She ran to the bed and grabbed Elias's Winchester rifle. She checked the chamber. Loaded. Outside, the horses skidded to a halt. The mud splashed against the cabin walls. Mrs. Miller! Silas Vance's voice was loud. It was smooth, cultured, and incredibly arrogant. It carried perfectly through the thin wooden walls. I know you're in there, my dear, Vance called out. I'm a reasonable man. Come out. Bring the ledgers you've been so busy writing in. Hand them over, and I will personally buy you a train ticket back to Boston. Clara stood with her back pressed against the wall next to the window. Her heart hammered against her ribs. You are trespassing, Mr. Vance, Clara shouted back. Her voice didn't shake. This is private property. Vance laughed. It was a cold, dry sound. This property will be mine by the end of the month, Vance said. Thorne has overextended himself. Now, Mrs. Miller, I am losing my patience. Those ledgers are full of lies, slander against my good name. Come out, or my men will burn that shack to the ground with you inside it. Clara gripped the rifle tight. She knew he wasn't bluffing. "You thought power was a shield, Mr. Vance," Clara shouted, anger momentarily overpowering her fear. "You treat men like cattle, but human rights outlive your money. The truth is already out." "Burn it," Vance said simply. A heavy boot kicked the front door. The wood groaned, but the iron latch held. Then, a gunshot cracked. One of Vance's men fired a round directly through the front window. The wavy glass exploded inward. Shards rained down on the cabin floor. Clara dropped to her knees, covering her head. "Last chance, widow!" a rough voice yelled. Clara scrambled across the floor. She rested the barrel of her rifle on the edge of the shattered window frame. She didn't aim to kill. She aimed for the dirt near the lead horse. She pulled the trigger. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder. The loud crack echoed off the trees. The bullet sprayed mud against the legs of Vance's horse. The animal reared, whinnying in panic. Vance cursed, struggling to hold the reins. "Fire!" Vance screamed. The cabin erupted. Bullets tore through the thin wooden walls. They splintered the cedar logs. They shredded the books on her table. Clara crawled flat on her belly, pressing herself against the heavy cast-iron stove for cover. The noise was deafening. Dust and wood chips filled the air. Thwack! A heavy-caliber bullet smashed through the floorboards near the bed. Crack! Another bullet hit the lower section of the log wall behind the stove. Clara covered her ears. The cabin was being torn to pieces. Suddenly, the gunfire from outside changed direction. A deep, booming roar echoed from the ridge above the cabin. It was a Buffalo Sharp's rifle. "Elias." "Take cover," Marcus's voice echoed across the valley. Clara peeked around the iron stove. Through the shattered window, she saw chaos. Elias and Marcus, along with half a dozen ranch hands, were charging down the ridge on horseback. They were firing in unison. Vance's men scrambled. 2 of them were knocked out of their saddles. The rest returned fire, but they were caught in a crossfire. Clara stayed low. She watched a bullet tear through the wall directly above her head. It struck a large, rotting knot in the wood paneling near the floorboards. The wood shattered. A large chunk of the wall caved in, revealing a dark, hollow space between the outer logs and the inner lining. Something fell out of the hole. It hit the floor with a heavy, dull thud. It was wrapped in dark, oiled canvas. It was tied tight with leather twine. Clara stared at it. The gunfight raged outside, but time inside the cabin slowed to a crawl. She reached out. Her fingers brushed the oily canvas. She pulled it toward her. She untied the leather string. Inside was a book. It wasn't a ranch ledger. It was a small black book. The cover was embossed with gold lettering. SV, Private Accounts. Clara opened it. The pages were filled with names, dozens of names, and next to each name were 2 columns: the real debt and the forged debt. Thomas Miller. Actual, $40. Forged, $1,000. Clara stopped breathing. It was Vance's master ledger, the one he kept hidden, the one that proved every single fraud he had ever committed. Thomas hadn't just come to Silver Creek to reason with Vance. He had stolen the proof. He had taken the ledger from Vance's office. He had run. He had found this abandoned line cabin in the dark, pried open a loose board, and hidden the ledger before Vance's men caught up to him and forced him into the canyon. The very roof Elias had given her to soothe his guilt had been hiding her husband's key to justice the entire time. Outside, the shooting abruptly stopped. "Drop the guns!" Elias roared. His voice was absolute thunder. Clara clutched the black book to her chest. She stood up. Her legs were shaking. She walked to the door. She lifted the iron latch and pushed it open. The scene outside was perfectly still. Vance's men were surrounded. They had dropped their rifles in the mud. Marcus held a shotgun leveled at them. Elias was walking slowly toward Silas Vance. Vance was on the ground. His horse had thrown him. He scrambled backward in the mud, his fine suit ruined. He reached inside his coat for a derringer. Elias didn't raise his rifle. He didn't flinch. He stepped forward, planted his heavy boot directly on Vance's wrist, and pinned it to the mud. Vance screamed, dropping the small gun. Elias reached down. He grabbed Vance by the collar of his expensive coat. He hauled the older man to his feet with one hand. Elias's face was a mask of cold, terrifying restraint. 4 years ago, Elias had pulled a trigger in panic. He had let violence rule him, not today. "You don't get a bullet, Silas," Elias said, his voice a low, lethal rumble. "Bullets are too quick. You are going to rot in a federal cell. You are going to watch everything you stole be handed back to the people you broke." Clara walked off the porch. Her boots sank into the mud. Elias turned his head. He saw her. He saw the black book in her hands. "I have it," Clara said. Her voice carried across the quiet yard. It was strong. It was victorious. "I have his ledger. Thomas hid it in the wall." Silas Vance's face went completely pale. The arrogance vanished. He looked at the book and he knew he was a dead man walking. "Justice isn't a bullet in the dark, Mr. Vance," Clara said, staring right at him. She spoke the words for Vance, for Elias, and for herself. "It's bringing the truth into the light. My husband brought it into the light, and you will hang for it." Elias looked at Clara. He saw the fierce, unbroken pride in her eyes. He didn't need to kill Vance. Clara had just executed him with a piece of paper. "Marcus," Elias ordered, not taking his eyes off Clara. "Tie him up. Throw him in the back of the wagon. We're riding to the U.S. Marshal in Denver." The ghost of Thomas Miller finally rested. The truth was out. But Elias knew, as he watched Clara hold that book, that his own reckoning was still waiting. 2 months passed. The snow finally melted. The thick mud dried into hard, cracked dirt. The valley turned green. The town of Silver Creek began to breathe again. Silas Vance did not see the spring. He sat in a federal penitentiary in Denver. The black ledger had been an iron chain. It locked him away for the rest of his natural life. The fraudulent debts were completely cleared. The terrified families who had lost their land returned. They started rebuilding their fences. They started planting their crops. Elias Thorne did not hide. The day after Vance was arrested, Elias rode his horse into town. He walked into the county courthouse. He went straight to the judge's chambers. He confessed. He laid out the entire truth about the night Thomas Miller died. He didn't ask for mercy. He asked for the law. The judge read Elias's written statement. He listened to Marcus's testimony. He read the county marshal's original flawed report. It wasn't murder. The law was clear on that. It was a tragic, chaotic accident in the middle of a heavily armed raid. Thomas Miller had died in the crossfire of a defensive property. But Elias had lied. He had hidden the truth. The judge handed down his ruling: accidental manslaughter, fired in self-defense. But the cover-up carried a severe penalty. Elias paid a massive financial restitution to Clara. He emptied his personal bank accounts. He sold a quarter of his herd to raise the cash. He didn't spend a day in a cell, but he paid heavily for his cowardice. He returned to Whispering Pines a much poorer man. He had less money. He had fewer cattle. But his chest was finally light. He could breathe. The heavy, rotting ghost of his lie was gone. He was a free man. But he was a lonely one. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The sun was warm. The sky was an endless clear blue. Clara Miller stood inside the line cabin. Her trunk was open on the rope bed. She folded a gray woolen dress. She smoothed the wrinkles with her hands. She placed it inside the leather trunk. The heavy iron latch clicked. Elias stood in the open doorway. He had taken his hat off before he knocked. He wore a clean white cotton shirt. His boots were brushed clean of dust. He looked at the open trunk. He saw the folded dresses. He didn't step inside. He stayed on the porch. He waited for her to speak. "You're packing," Elias said. His voice was quiet. It didn't hold that commanding rumble anymore. It sounded tired. "I am," Clara said. She didn't stop folding her clothes. "The new ledgers are balanced. The workers are paid. Vance is in prison. The work I set out to do is done." Elias nodded slowly. He looked down at the floorboards. "I brought the settlement papers," Elias said. He reached into his shirt pocket. He pulled out a thick, sealed envelope. "The restitution funds. They have been transferred to a bank in Boston. It's enough to buy a very good house. It's enough to live comfortably. You won't ever have to scrub a floor again for the rest of your life." He walked over to the small wooden table. He set the envelope down. He didn't try to hand it to her directly. He didn't want to force her to take it from his hand. He stepped back immediately. Clara stopped folding. She looked at the thick envelope. Then she looked at Elias. He looked different. The heavy, crushing guilt was gone from his wide shoulders. But in its place was a stark, open vulnerability. He was a man completely stripped bare of his pride. He was accepting his punishment. "You paid the debt," Clara said softly. "I paid the fine," Elias corrected her. He met her eyes squarely. "I can never pay the debt, Clara. You lost a good man. I took him from you. Money doesn't fix that. I know that." He took a step back toward the door. He was going to let her go. He was going to stand there and watch the only woman he had ever truly loved walk away. He believed it was the righteous thing to do. He believed she deserved a clean slate, far away from the man who broke her heart. Clara let her hands drop to her sides. "Elias." He stopped at the threshold. He turned back. Clara walked around the bed. She picked up the envelope. She held it in both hands. She didn't break the wax seal. "When I came to this territory," Clara said, her voice was clear and steady. It commanded the room, "I demanded to be treated as an equal. I told you that women and men must be judged by their actions, not their gender, not their circumstances." "And you were exactly right," Elias said. "Yes, I was." Clara took a deliberate step toward him. "But true equality is not just about wages, Elias. It is not just about hard labor in the fields. It is about how we look at each other's flaws. It is about holding each other to the exact same standard of grace." Elias held his breath. He didn't move. "You made a terrible, cowardly choice 4 years ago," Clara stated plainly. She didn't soften the blow. She spoke the truth. "You acted out of fear. You hid. But you spent the last 2 months acting out of pure courage. You surrendered your absolute pride. You surrendered your wealth. You helped me secure justice for Thomas, even when it meant risking your own life and your own freedom." She stepped closer. The space between them was just a few inches now. "I want to make something perfectly clear to you," Clara said. She spoke the words firmly. She needed him to understand the exact lesson of their survival. "Forgiveness isn't about erasing the past, Elias. We can never erase what happened to Thomas in that canyon. Forgiveness is about looking at each other's deep scars. It is about respecting that pain. It is deciding that love holds far more power than resentment. It is an active, daily choice to build a future, rather than remain chained to a tragedy." Elias stared at her. His gray eyes were wide with shock. "You offered me a job and a roof when I had absolutely nothing," Clara continued. Her voice softened, but her conviction remained ironclad. "You didn't ask for anything in return. You treated me with absolute dignity. Now my work here is done. I have the means to leave this place." She dropped the thick envelope back onto the table. It landed with a heavy final thud. "I don't need your roof to survive anymore," Clara said. She looked directly up into his eyes. "So if I stay, it is not out of necessity. It is out of a free choice. I want to stay, Elias. Not for the ranch. Not for the wages. Because I choose the man who stands under this roof." Elias closed his eyes. A single, ragged breath tore from his chest. It was the sound of a drowning man finally breaking the surface of the water. He was breathing for the first time in 4 years. He opened his eyes. He reached out. His massive, calloused hands gently framed her face. His rough thumbs brushed her cheekbones. His touch was incredibly gentle, incredibly reverent. "Clara," Elias whispered. He didn't make a grand promise. He didn't swear a loud oath. He just leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't a desperate, frantic kiss. It was slow. It was deep. It was the kiss of a man who had been starving for years, finally sitting down to a feast. Clara closed her eyes. She reached up. Her hands gripped the heavy cotton of his shirt. She pulled him closer. She kissed him back with equal strength. The ghost was truly gone. The past was finally settled. They were just two people, standing in a small cabin, choosing to live again. 6 months later. The sun was setting over whispering pines. The sky was a brilliant, fiery canvas. Slashes of bright orange and deep purple stretched across the horizon. The evening air was cool and crisp. Elias and Clara stood on the wide wooden porch of the main house. They didn't stand like a boss and an employee. They didn't stand like a guilty savior and a broken widow. They stood shoulder to shoulder. They stood as absolute equals. Clara held a fresh ledger in her hands. The numbers were clean. The ranch was thriving again. They had slowly rebuilt the herds. They had hired back the men Silas Vance had chased away. They had built a proper, insulated schoolhouse for the children in the valley. Elias leaned his back against the wooden railing. He watched the horses running in the lower corral. He wore his heavy canvas duster against the evening chill. He looked at Clara. He smiled. It was a real, genuine smile. It reached his gray eyes and softened the hard lines of his face. "Marcus says the new barbed wire is holding firm on the north ridge," Elias said. "Good," Clara said. She closed the leather ledger with a snap. "Because we are not buying any more wire until the spring. We need the extra funds for the new bunkhouse roof. The men deserve a dry place to sleep." Elias chuckled. It was a low, rich rumble in his chest. "You're the boss, Mrs. Thorne." Clara smiled. She leaned her shoulder against his arm. He wrapped his heavy arm around her waist, pulling her close against his side. "We are partners, Elias," Clara corrected him gently. "In the account books, and in this life." "Partners," Elias agreed. He pressed a kiss to the top of her auburn hair. They stood together in the fading light. They watched the long shadows stretch across the vast valley. The world was still hard. The frontier was still an unforgiving place. The winters would still be brutal. But they had built something far stronger than iron and blood. They had built a home founded on absolute truth. They had built it on mutual respect. They had built it on a mature love that had been tested by fire, battered by lies, and still managed to survive. Elias Thorne had offered a desperate woman a job. He had offered her a leaky roof, and Clara Miller had taken his whole heart. She kept it safe, and he kept hers. That was the only truth that mattered now. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.
The story of Clara Miller and Elias Thorne leaves us with a lesson that reaches far beyond the dust, snow, and silence of the western frontier. At its heart, this is not only a tale about a widow searching for the truth, or a cowboy haunted by guilt. It is a story about human dignity, about the weight of secrets, and about the courage it takes to face what we have done. Clara reminds us that no person should ever be reduced to their poverty, their grief, or their weakness in the eyes of the world. Even when she has no home, no money, and no protection, she still carries something no one can steal from her: her self-respect. Her journey teaches us that the truth matters, not because it can bring back the dead, but because it honors the life they lived. A person's story should not be buried under fear, corruption, or convenience. Every life has value, every loss deserves to be acknowledged, and every voice deserves to be heard. Elias, on the other hand, shows us that kindness alone is not enough if it is built on silence. Good deeds cannot erase a hidden wrong. Real redemption begins only when a person is willing to stop running, confess the truth, and accept the pain that comes with it. His guilt shows us that the past does not disappear simply because we refuse to speak of it. It waits, it grows heavier, and one day it demands to be faced. Through their pain, this story reminds us that forgiveness is not simple, and it should never be forced. Forgiveness must come after truth, after accountability, and after the wounded heart has been given the respect it deserves. The meaning of this story is also found in compassion. In a harsh world where powerful men like Silas Vance treat human beings like tools, Clara and Elias show us another way. To protect the weak, to respect honest labor, to stand against injustice, and to remember that true strength is not measured by violence, wealth, or control. True strength is measured by mercy, honesty, sacrifice, and the willingness to carry another person's pain without trying to own it. This Western tale teaches us that love cannot survive without truth, justice cannot live without courage, and no soul can be healed while hiding behind a lie. In the end, the frontier is not only a place of guns and horses, it is a place where the human heart is tested. And this story asks every listener a quiet but powerful question. When the truth finally stands at your door, will you hide from it, or will you have the courage to open it?